What does it take to set up a large planted aquarium? I've had lots of questions lately about what fish are in here, how I designed and set up this tank, and what I do for maintenance. So that's exactly what I'm covering today. Let's get going. What up, fish friends? My name is Michael. I am the owner of Way Too Many Aquariums and an aquarium cleaning business. Today we're going to be looking at this tank behind me. It's actually a tank that I keep at home, my favorite home tank, mostly because of the Boesemani rainbows in there. But let's take a trip back to when it all started 1 year ago. This was a used tank. I found it on Facebook Marketplace for 300 bucks. It came with the tank and the stand, which is a pretty good deal. It's not like absolutely amazing, but it's maybe like a third of the price of a new one. I did take some time to put some silicone here in between the tank and the stand. That's because the waterproof paint or finish that's used on the stand was starting to come off. This particle board here is really good at absorbing water, and it can create some gaps, like, high points if water gets in there and there. Those two areas are going to push up, creating kind of a divot along the bottom of the tank. Not just an aesthetic thing, but it really helps keep your tank and stand safe, protects your investment. So go ahead and do that if you're like me and you're buying a used tank. Most of the tanks I set up, I like to have some sort of a background on the glass. It helps to hide the cables and the plumbing and that sort of stuff in the back, and also create a good sense of contrast between the fish and the back of the tank. Like, my wall is kind of light colored, which isn't the worst thing, but because I knew from the get-go I wanted Boesemani rainbows in this tank, I decided to paint it black because that's really gonna make these blue and orange fish pop like crazy. Also, when you're dealing with a tank like this that's got the black brace or rim around the top and bottom, I think that black really is the way to go. I've tried gray or white a couple times and it just looks kind of funny. Not that those colors are bad, they look really good on a rimless tank or something like that, but it kind of contrasts the black brace and looks a bit funny in my opinion. I had a very loose plan going into this. I knew that I wanted it to be like kind of a triangle composition where we have plants built up really tall on one side and then kind of open on the other side. So I started laying down these rocks and wood to kind of promote or encourage that layout. Where we have most of the hardscape building up towards the right side of the tank, this is where tons of plants are going to grow and tower over things. And then on the left side of the tank, things should be relatively open. Now, granted, you've seen how I have this tank set up like right now, and actually things have filled in a lot on the left. Another goal I had with regards to the hardscape was to create a cave. It's not a cave in the strictest sense by any means. It's open on all sides really, except for the top, and then some structure on the sides. But the idea for this cave here is to create an opening underneath where fish can swim around, likely the alpha fish who claims this really cool territory. But then I'll have a spot on top where I can wedge in some Java ferns, some Bulbitis, that sort of stuff to create a really dense bushy jungle, but also cast a lot of shade down here. I really want these leaves to kind of poke out over the wood and provide lots of spots for fish to swim in and out of. It's somewhere where I see fish spawning and laying eggs and that sort of stuff. So this shadow is something that I try and incorporate in every tank that I set up. This cave right here is going to be really dark and create an excellent sense of contrast between the rest of the tank. So now that I got all of this wood and rock placed out how I want it, it's time to silicone that in place. Sometimes you want to use silicone because wood tends to float. This is Mopani wood, really dense stuff. Even when it's not waterlogged, it's super heavy and probably won't float. But if I want to keep the wood in the same position that it is without it falling over every time I scrub algae or my pleco digs around underneath it, I'm gonna have to glue it in place. Silicone is my go-to glue because it's waterproof and it's very, very durable. Silicone, after all, is the adhesive that they use to stick aquariums together. So, you know, it's holding back like 1,500 pounds worth of pressure in this tank along those seals with just a very small amount of silicone. Using thick daubs of silicone is going to ensure that this wood and rock stays exactly where I want it. Another reason that I glue everything into place is so that I can really barricade the hardscape line. So I'm using it to hold soil in the back and sand in the front. It's a really sharp, crisp finish to a tank. Not something I do for every tank, but unless I'm running like a really, really high-tech system with intense light growing plants all along the whole front to back, left to right of the tank, then I'm probably going to use sand, because I'm never going to get plants to grow super well down here with a kind of modest level of light. So it's best to plan ahead and think about what's going to look really good here. I think a few scattered plants, sand, and these really round stones. Speaking of which, these stones are Mexican beach pebbles. I got them at my local landscaping store. They are the most expensive stone at the landscaping store, but still by far cheaper than anything you'd find at the fish store. And it's not that I don't like the stones they sell at the fish store, but in order to find enough stones to fill up this whole 6-foot long tank, I'd be probably spending a few $100, whereas I spent $80 for 3 bucketfuls of this Mexican beach pebble, and it left me with tons of leftovers that I can use for other of my projects or builds for my clients in the future. So in creating this barrier between the front and back of the tank, it's really important to take extra time to really seal that up. If there's a small gap in this hardscape and I plop the soil in the back, the sand in the front, and fill it up, it's going to be a lot more difficult to go back and retroactively seal that gap in the barrier versus doing it now. So really take your time and go through there. Now adding soil to the back of the tank, it's kind of a mixture of whatever soils I had laying around. I'm not like brand loyal when it comes to soil, unless someone's giving me something for free, which then in case I'm definitely going to be brand loyal. But for now, I'm just using some fluval substratum that I got on sale at Petco. This stuff is normally kind of pricey, but when it's on sale at Petco and PetSmart, your local big box stores, it can be really, really cheap. If you're buying there, always go online and look to see what they're selling it for online, because I ended up getting this stuff like almost half off, even though it wasn't labeled that way in store. They will match their online sale price. So going through here, filling up all that soil, I did top it off with some random mix of substrate that I have in like a big bin from leftover projects. And then I went through and put root tabs everywhere, since there's a relatively thin layer of soil here and some of it is used. The root tabs really help to give the plants that extra nutrient load that they love. Now for the sand, this is where things really start to look magical for me. It's Carib Sea Supernaturals, so not the cheapest sand, but because I'm putting a lot of catfish in here, mostly cories, I wanted that sand to be really soft. If you put in harder, coarser sand like play sand, all that means is that the chunks are going to be bigger. They're going to have more jagged edges on them, not the kind of thing you really notice just by looking without a magnifying lens. But as soon as you magnify it, you can see it almost looks like glass chunks, like big chunks with jagged edges. So this isn't going to be the best for cories to filter through their gills, and that's one of the most fun things about having cories, getting to watch them filter sand through their gills and their little whiskers going around. I absolutely love cories, and Now looking at some of these larger pebbles, I'd say they're more like rocks at this point, but some of these guys look kind of lonely next to the sand layer. So it's really important when doing any aquascape that you use different size stones. So I like to take my biggest stone and then put a medium one next to it, and then maybe 3 or 4 small ones, and then maybe 10 smaller ones, and then 15 microscopic ones. So we really want to create that sense of scale. Can't have a planted tank without plants, so let's look at the plants that I put in here. A lot of the plants when I started were kind of geared towards a high-tech tank. My goal was to use really strong lighting and intense CO2 and fertilizer in this tank, but things for some reason really never took off and did well that way. So a lot of the plants that I started off with kind of faded out, and I've replaced them with hardier plants that do well with less intense lighting and less CO2 and less fertilizer, all that stuff. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the equipment section. Regardless, lots of stem plants in the back, tons of Java fern and bulbitis along this chunk of wood here, and then some pygmy chainsword along the front, which has kind of been overrun by Valsinaria at this point, but they're essentially the same thing when you keep them this short. If you watched my build video for this tank, you'll remember that I talked about my disappointment with this tank, how I kept struggling with algae, and no matter how much I fussed and tinkered with CO2 and fertilizer and all that sort of stuff, it just kept coming back stronger and stronger. So what I've done in the meantime is I've actually switched out the lights for some lower intensity ones. These are like the Haiger smart lights. They're not actually that smart. They're just normal lights that hook up to your smartphone. It's a pretty decent light. There's 2 of them here, just the sizes needed to fill the length of the tank, and then I got them dangling from these brackets because otherwise they'd sit right on the tank and the light wouldn't really spread out far enough. I'd probably need to double down on them. After I changed this light out, I noticed that some of the more demanding stem plants did kind of piddle out, and that's all right. I knew that was going to happen, but I've just replaced them with really fast growing, easier stem plants like Stargrass Heteranthera zostrifolia. It's one of my absolute favorites. Then we got a couple types of hygrophila in there. That stuff grows like crazy. What else? Limnophila hipporoides. This is a really cool plant that you can get some nice red and orange colors out of without having to go too crazy on the lights and CO2 and all that sort of stuff. And then I just jam-packed the bottom portions of this tank with Anubias in the meantime, because a lot of these rocks were starting to get covered in algae. And then naturally, dialing back the light, you have to think about dialing back CO2 and fertilizer. Without the light turbocharging these plants to consume CO2 and fertilizer, there's no point in adding that stuff. The plants are growing at half the pace, then cut out on half the CO2 and fertilizer. And I actually went back way more on that stuff. I cut it down to maybe like just trace amounts of CO2, not even enough to really change the way this bubble checker looks. And then fertilizer, I think I'm down to like a quarter of what I was using before. I have cut out fertilizer altogether and noticed that there was a substantial difference between how my plants looked then and how they looked with even the trace amounts of fertilizer. So a lot of people will give you this advice: you don't need to use fertilizers in your tank, not a big deal, just go with fish waste. But I have a lot of fish in this tank that I feed like crazy. I do tons of frozen food in this tank. They're spitting out a lot of waste, and my plants consume all of that. Not to mention, there is also benefits to adding fertilizer in the way that you're going to get lots of things that aren't included in fish waste, mainly with regards to the micronutrients, stuff like boron, zinc, molybdenum, copper, iron, those sorts of things. I just don't think fish are pooping those stuff out. And actually, it's a fact. You can look it up. They don't really poop that stuff out. So at the very least, use some micro fertilizers in your tank. When my ferts run out and I forgot to check, I noticed because my plants weren't doing well. Let's take a look at livestock. Livestock is something that a lot of people ask about when I put B-roll footage of this over my other YouTube videos. What kind of fish do you have in that tank? So let's talk about that. My favorite fish in this tank is kind of a toss-up. I love Big Red here. He is a male cockatoo apistogramma. He's got crazy bright red fins and kind of a grumpy face, but he's actually pretty chill fish. I decided to not have a female in here initially because they get a little bit more territorial when you keep the males and females together. Boesemani rainbows are the reason I set this tank up. They are an absolutely gorgeous fish. Very, very slow growing. So even though I've had them for maybe 9 months now, and they've put on a lot of color and some decent size, even my wife noticed that they got bigger, and she mentioned that to me, which is not something that always happens. But yeah, I'm glad when she notices these things. Anyways, yeah, they grow slowly, put on lots of color. The males are this blue and orange color with the dominant ones showing some vertical stripes in between the blue and orange parts. And then the females are this gold to brown color with lots of different color scales. There's some green ones, some yellow ones, some hues of red and orange. Some other really, really cool fish in this tank are the ornate bushfish. Not a fish that you see every day. They're related to the paradise fish, who can, by the way, be extreme buttheads, but these bushfish seem to be really chill in terms of temperament. They do kind of get on after each other a little bit. They have their own little territories, but they don't seem to mess with any of the other species in this tank. They hide a lot of the time. They kind of pick these Java fern spots, hang out under the leaves. You'll just see their face like poking through. But as soon as I drop food in this tank, they are out hungry and ready to eat. Someone else that people ask a lot about is this whiptail catfish down here, Pseudohemiodon something or another. Someone bred this fish and gave him to me. Unfortunately, he did lose his eyes when he was very young, I think, and a pistogramma saw his eyes sticking out of the sand, and he picked the eyeballs out, and they got infected and didn't grow back because eyeballs don't grow back. But unfortunately, he does actually live a pretty healthy life in this tank despite being blind. He has a really good schnoz on him, and he can smell whenever food enters the tank, and he gets all sorts of crazy and zips towards the food, then spends pretty much the rest of the day laying mostly concealed in the sand with the top parts of his body sticking out, so much so that it's actually grown blackbeard algae all over him. So I've never had a fish that spends so much time chilling that they've grown blackbeard algae. This guy absolutely cracks me up. Super hilarious fish. He's like walking around on his pectoral fins, bopping around, and he's got a little bit of a personality. Then we got these glow light danios, my favorite types of danios. I've had them for quite a few years now, and I think some of them are starting to die of old age, but they are really vibrant colors. They are danios, so you want to keep them in groups. Otherwise, they'll beat the hell out of each other and start nipping on other fish. Fortunately, the rainbows keep them in check because they are definitely the tank bosses here. And then can't forget to mention Corys. I absolutely love Cory catfish. I got about 2 to 3 dozen in here, maybe a dozen concolor Corys. And then the other type of Cory that I have in this tank is the Venezuelan hyphen. They've done quite a bit of breeding. The young used to survive until the rainbows entered this tank. they definitely don't make it in here. I've taken the eggs out on a couple occasions and raised them to adults and then stuck them in this tank. Last but not least, let's talk about maintenance. What does it take to keep a tank like this going and running and looking relatively clean? I clean it every 3 weeks. Usually I do a big old water change, 50%. And I go through, I pull algae out. Mostly hair algae in here is what I'm dealing with. I just grab it with my hand and pull it out and toss it in a bucket. I do some big trimming sessions, maybe like every couple months. But since I've lowered the lighting, I don't have to spend as much time trimming. I do really make sure to get in this Java fern and this African water fern, Boesemani, and trim out the leaves. It's very easy for these bundles to get incredibly crowded the longer you have a tank, and it can be kind of like a rite of passage, right? You're like, yeah, check out this rad Boesemani, and I don't want to trim the leaves because it's such a big bushy plant. But that's when things actually start to backfire. Sediment gets stuck in the middle of this plant, so it's a really good idea to thin out the leaves. And then rather than having like 100 moderately healthy leaves, you can have 15 really long healthy leaves. And then as the younger ones grow in, you can clip out some of the older ones. At this point, they're likely starting to accumulate algae anyways, so it's not a big deal. Every now and then I'll flip the rocks over as they get algae on them. One of the biggest hassles with this tank is that the sand gets blown around and it covers all of these little pebbles. These little pebbles that I've spent so much time talking about today, how much I love all these little pebbles. And then I got to go through with a net and kind of shimmy them out of the sand layer, kick the sand back in, and then plot them on top. But that's kind of a tedious process, one that I don't do as often as I would like to in order to enjoy the stones in there, but I'll do it for you today so you can see what I'm talking about and how much I love the way this tank looks. The filters are a little more important to clean out routinely. As I have a discus tank, I'm always doing water changes on that, so I'll just drain a couple buckets and then clear out my pre-filter sponges. They're really awesome because you can just take out this ring of sponges, clean them out in like 60 seconds. You don't have to open the whole canister apart for maybe 2 or 3 times a year. They really stay clean and they're easy to maintain, which is why I love them. Another cool thing about them is they have a heater built into them, so you don't have to have extra equipment running inside the tank. That's kind of one of my pet peeves, is tons of equipment inside tanks. Just takes away from the plants and the fish and the rocks and wood and all that sort of stuff. Otherwise, scrub the glass every 3 weeks or so whenever I'm doing my big maintenance. Make sure to clean the front and all that sort of stuff. But this tank has ended up being a lot easier to maintain with the changes that I've made. As much as I love growing plants like crazy, I think a medium-sized tank is easier to manage a high-tech system. A tank this size just kind of becomes a nightmare to manage all of that stuff. And at the end of the day, I really have this tank for my Boesemani rainbows, and they're just as gorgeous with or without the high-tech equipment and all that sort of stuff. So happy with this tank. Let me know, did I answer all your questions about how I set this up, what my goals were, and what livestock there is? Drop a question if you got any. Hit that like, subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. Want to support me financially? Buy something through an affiliate link. I'll leave the equipment that I use to set this tank up. Anyways, thanks so much. I appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.